The summer Adeline Marsh turned 22. She was handed over to a stranger for the price of a train ticket and a signed piece of paper. It wasn't called selling, the man who arranged it. Her father's older brother, Clement Ferris, a dry goods merchant from Abilene, who smelled of pipe tobacco and looked at her the way men looked at livestock before a fair, called it a sensible arrangement. He said it with the kind of satisfaction that came from solving a problem without having to live with the consequences. Adeline was the problem. Her father had died in April, owing money to 3 different people, and Clement had no interest in absorbing a 22-year-old niece with no dowry and no prospects into his household. He had a wife who wouldn't have it and a reputation to protect. So he wrote a letter west. The reply came from a man named Gideon Pratt, a cattle rancher in Harwick County, Montana Territory. Widower, 2 children, needed someone to keep the house and mind the young ones. Clement told Adeline she was lucky. He told her this while she packed her single trunk on a Tuesday in June, with the Kansas heat pressing in through the window and the sound of Clement's wife humming to herself somewhere down the hall. Adeline didn't feel lucky. She felt the same way she'd felt standing at her father's grave 3 months before, hollowed out like something had been scooped from the center of her and not replaced. She'd learned to keep walking anyway. You didn't sit down in the middle of a field just because you were tired. You kept moving until you found somewhere to stop. The train ride to Montana took 4 days. She spent most of it staring out the window at the country, changing underneath her. Flat Kansas giving way to rolling Nebraska, then the land rising and buckling into something wilder as they pushed north and west. By the time they crossed into Montana territory, the sky had become enormous, the kind of sky that made you feel small in a way that was almost peaceful. She arrived in the town of Grover Creek on a Thursday afternoon. It was small. A general store, a post office, a church, a saloon, and a scattering of houses, and the air smelled like pine and horse, and something metallic like rain coming in off the mountains. Adeline stepped off the platform with her trunk and stood there squinting in the sun, looking for a man she'd never met. She found him before he found her. He was leaning against a hitching post near the livery, arms crossed, hat pulled low against the afternoon glare. Gideon Pratt was older than she'd imagined from the letter. Mid-40s maybe, though weathered men were hard to age. Broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been set in a permanent expression of endurance. He wasn't cruel-looking. He wasn't kind-looking either. He looked like a man who'd had the luxury of feeling things a long time ago and had given it up as impractical. He spotted her and pushed off the post. "Miss Marsh?" His voice was low, flat, that's right. He looked her over the way she'd looked him over, direct, assessing no particular warmth in it. She didn't flinch. She'd been looked at her whole life by people deciding how much she was worth. She'd gotten used to looking back. "Wagons this way," he said. He picked up her trunk without asking. She followed him. They rode in silence for the first hour, the wagon rolling out of town and into open country. The mountains were closer here, their peaks still capped with white even in June. The road, more ruts than road really, wound through grassland and stands of pine, rising and dipping with the terrain. Adeline braced herself against the bench and watched the land go by and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Gideon didn't seem to want conversation. He drove with his eyes on the road and his hands loose on the reins and his mouth closed. "How far?" she finally asked. "Another hour. What are their names?" "The children." His hands tightened briefly on the reins. Then he said, "Nell, she's 8, and Boyd, he's 12. How long has it been?" "Since their mother, 3 years." 2 words, flat as a door slamming. Adeline let the silence come back. The ranch appeared out of the pines just as the sun was starting to drop. It was more substantial than she'd expected. A main house built from squared logs, a barn with a new roof, a separate building that might have been a smokehouse, corrals on the east side holding a dozen horses. It wasn't prosperous, exactly, but it had been cared for. Whatever Gideon Pratt was, he wasn't a man who let things fall apart without a fight. He pulled the wagon to a stop and got down and didn't look back at her. "Inside," he said. "They're waiting." Adeline climbed down herself, picked up the small bag she'd kept on the seat beside her, and walked to the door. She pushed it open. The room was bigger than the outside suggested. Kitchen and living space together, a stone fireplace, a plank table with 4 chairs, oil lamps that needed trimming. It smelled like wood smoke and bacon grease and old wool, and standing by the table, watching her, were the children. The boy, Boyd, stood with his arms crossed exactly the way his father had, his jaw set in the same line. Dark-haired, angular, already growing into the shape of a man he'd probably be someday. He looked at her like she was something that needed to be survived. The girl was smaller and rounder, with light brown hair and 2 braids that had mostly come undone. She clutched a carved wooden horse in both hands and stared at Adeline with eyes that were very large and very serious. Nobody said anything. Adeline set her bag down. I'm Adeline, she said. I know you weren't expecting me. I mean, you were, but you weren't. That's all right? Boyd said nothing. His eyes narrowed. The little girl? Nell tilted her head. Do you know how to make biscuits? Boyd shot her a look. She ignored it. I do, Adeline said. Our last housekeeper burned them every time, Nell. Gideon's voice from behind her, already removing his coat. It's true, Nell said, untroubled. Something in the girl's directness made Adeline want to smile, though she kept it off her face. I'll try not to burn them. Nell nodded, satisfied, and went back to her wooden horse. Boyd walked out of the room without a word. Gideon showed her where she'd sleep. A narrow room at the back of the house, with a window that looked out toward the barn and a small iron stove for when the nights got cold. It had probably been a storage room once. The walls were plain wood and the floor had a rag rug that was faded but clean. It's fine, Adeline said before he could apologize or not apologize. He nodded and left. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wall and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Outside, the wind picked up, moving through the pines. Inside, she could hear Nell talking to herself somewhere, and the low-soo sound of Gideon moving through the kitchen. She'd been sold for a train ticket and a piece of paper, and this was where it had taken her. She'd survived worse, she thought. The first week was hard in the way that new things are hard, not because the work was unfamiliar, but because everything else was. The rhythms of the house, which child needed what kind of handling, which silences meant nothing and which ones were warning signs. Adeline moved carefully, like someone stepping onto ice she hadn't tested yet. Boyd refused to speak to her directly. He'd answer if Gideon asked him a question in front of her, but if Adeline asked him anything, did he want more at supper? Where was the water bucket kept? What time did he usually get up? He'd just look at her with those flat, careful eyes and walk away. It wasn't cruelty. It was armor, and she recognized it because she'd worn the same kind herself. Nell was easier, and in some ways harder. She followed Adeline everywhere, chattering about the horses by name, about her teacher in town who smelled like lavender, about a family of foxes she'd spotted near the east fence 2 winters ago. She talked with the relentless energy of a child who'd spent 3 years without enough people to talk to. But sometimes she'd stop mid-sentence and go very still, and the look on her face was ancient and private, and Adeline knew better than to ask about it. Gideon himself was a puzzle she wasn't sure she was meant to solve. He worked from before sunup until past dark, coming in only for meals which he ate quickly and without comment. He wasn't rude. He said thank you when she put food in front of him. He said good morning when she was already in the kitchen when he came through. But there was a distance in him, deliberate and maintained, like he'd drawn a border somewhere around himself, and was very careful about who crossed it. One morning she came out early and found him already at the table with a cup of coffee, staring at nothing. He didn't notice her right away. In that unguarded moment, before he put the door back up behind his eyes, she saw something she wasn't supposed to see. He looked tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Morning, she said, and he straightened. Morning. She started the fire and didn't say anything else. The mountains around Grover Creek held their snow until nearly July, and when it finally melted, the whole country turned green so fast it seemed almost violent. Grass pushing up through mud, wildflowers cracking through patches of gravel, the sky going a blue so deep it hurt to look at. Adeline started a kitchen garden in the plot behind the house that had gone to weeds. It gave her something to do with her hands in the afternoons, and something to think about that wasn't the peculiar loneliness of living among people who hadn't decided yet whether to let her exist in their world. Nell came out one afternoon while Adeline was pulling weeds. What are you planting, Beans? Squash. Tomatoes if the season holds long enough. Mama used to grow tomatoes. The girl said it without particular emotion, the way children sometimes say things that would crack an adult in two. What kind? Nell frowned, considering. Red ones. Adeline smiled at the ground. Those are the best kind. Nell sat on the edge of the garden plot and watched her work for a while. Then she said, Boyd doesn't like you. I know. He doesn't like anyone new. That's all right. He liked the woman before you, but then she left. Nell picked at the grass beside her boot. He said he wasn't going to do that again. Adeline sat back on her heels. Like what? Like her. Nell met her eyes. He said he wasn't going to like someone and then have them leave. The simplicity of it landed hard. Adeline thought about the right thing to say, and then set the right thing aside in favor of the true thing. That's a smart way to protect yourself, she said. I understand it. Nell looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached over and pulled a weed Adeline had missed. They worked in silence until supper. Boyd began to crack, slowly the way ice does when the temperature climbs. Not all at once, just hairline fractures that spread without announcement. She noticed it first when she was mending a harness on the porch one afternoon, and he stopped a few feet away, watching her hands. You're doing that wrong, he said. She looked up. He looked like he immediately wished he hadn't spoken. "Show me," she said. He hesitated. Then he sat on the step, took the harness from her, and showed her the proper way to stitch the leather, his fingers moving with a competence that surprised her. She didn't comment on it. She just watched and learned, and when he handed it back, she did it the right way, and he said nothing, but he didn't leave either. He sat on that step for another 20 minutes, before he finally stood and walked away. The next morning she found him in the kitchen before she was up, trying to make coffee and making a mess of it. She stood in the doorway in her work clothes and didn't laugh, even though some part of her wanted to. "The grounds go in after the water heats," she said. He looked at her. Then, for the first time since she'd arrived, he didn't walk away. He stepped back and let her show him. It was the size of a quarter that moment, but it was real. August came in hot and strange, the way Montana summers could turn without warning. The grass dried out fast and the creek dropped, and Gideon came in from the south pasture one evening, with a face that made the children go quiet without being told. "Fence is down on the south ridge," he said at supper. "Cattle got into Alderton's fields." Nell looked at her bowl. Boyd said nothing, but he gripped his fork tighter. Adeline didn't know who Alderton was, but she could read the weight of the name in the room. She found out later that night, when Gideon was still awake at the table with a ledger open in front of him, a thing she'd come to recognize as a bad sign. She poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one beside him, and sat down across from him. He looked at the coffee, then at her. "Alderton owns the land east and south of us," he said, which she hadn't asked but understood she was being told. "He's been wanting to buy me out for 4 years. Cattle getting into his field gives him standing to complain to the county. If he makes enough noise, he could push for a settlement. Can he do that? If he's got a lawyer, and I don't." Gideon's jaw was tight. "Which is where we stand." Adeline wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "What did he say?" "When you talked to him." "Said I owed him damages. Said if we can't come to an arrangement, he'll take it to the county clerk." "What kind of arrangement?" Gideon's expression closed. "The kind where I sell him my south pasture." She was quiet for a moment. "And if you don't sell? Then I keep fighting it and hope he gets tired before I do." "How much of that has happened before?" He looked at her. "Enough." She didn't push. She learned when not to push. They sat in silence for a while with the coffee going cold, and then she said, "I can go to town tomorrow if you need supplies. I could stop by the general store. Talk to people." He frowned. "Why?" "Because people talk to women differently than they talk to men. And someone in that town knows what Alderton actually wants." She met his eyes. "It's usually not what they say they want." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, exactly, but a reappraisal. "The general store is run by a woman named Paulson," he said. "She knows everything that happens in Grover Creek. Then I'll talk to Mrs. Paulson." She went the next morning, with Nell beside her, the girl bouncing on the wagon seat and asking questions about everything they passed. Mrs. Paulson was a sharp-featured woman of 60 who took one look at Adeline and seemed to decide to like her on the spot, the way some older women will make up their minds about a person before they've said a word. They talked for an hour, ostensibly about flour and lamp oil, and whether the preacher's new wife had settled in. And by the end of it, Adeline had what she'd come for. Alderton didn't want the south pasture. He wanted water rights to the creek that ran through it. Rights that Gideon's grandfather had secured in a deed that predated Alderton's claim to the land. That was the whole of it. She told Gideon that evening after supper when the children were in bed. He was quiet for a long moment. "You got all that from talking to the storewoman. She's been watching this town for 40 years. People like to think they're private. They're not. And if I give him the water rights, you'd keep the land. You'd keep the pasture. You'd lose access to the creek during dry months. But," she paused, "you have the well. You told me it runs clear year-round." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "That's right, then it's worth considering." He didn't answer right away. He sat with it the way he sat with most things, like a man who'd been burned before by deciding too fast. "How'd you know to ask?" he finally said. "I didn't know. I just thought people don't usually fight this hard over what they say they're fighting over." She shrugged. "Mostly they want something else and don't know how to ask for it straight." Gideon was quiet again. Then he said, "I'll ride over to Alderton's tomorrow." "I know." He looked at her like he was about to say something. Then he changed his mind and stood and said good night and went to his room. Adeline sat alone by the low fire and turned her coffee cup in her hands. She'd done the same thing for her father once, twice, a dozen times. Figured out what the other party really wanted and found a path through the middle. Her father had always seemed vaguely surprised by it, like he'd expected her to be less useful than she turned out to be. She wondered if Gideon was beginning to have that same problem. The Alderton business settled in September, a trade of water rights during the 3 driest months of the year for a signed agreement that the land dispute was closed. Gideon came home from Alderton's place with something Adeline hadn't seen on him before. Not a smile, exactly, but a lightening around the eyes. He agreed? She asked. He agreed. The land was safe, the pasture was safe, and Gideon looked at her across the kitchen table that evening with the closest thing to gratitude she'd yet seen from him. Thank you, he said. Just that. You did the hard part, she said. You rode over there. He huffed something that might have been a laugh and went back to his food. But Boyd looked at her across the table, and something in his face was different, like he'd revised something privately and hadn't decided what to do about it yet. The revision happened in stages. The first stage was the questions. Boyd started asking Adeline small things, where she was from, how long the trip had taken, whether she'd ever seen real mountains before Montana. He asked them carefully like he was testing the ground, and she answered honestly without making more of them than they were. The second stage was the afternoon in the barn when she found him trying to doctor a deep cut on the gray mare's foreleg and struggling with it, his hands not quite sure enough, and the horse not quite calm enough. Adeline had grown up with horses. She stepped in without asking, taking the mare's halter and talking low, and the horse settled in the way horses sometimes did, and Boyd watched her hands, and when it was over he said quietly, "How'd you do that?" She needed someone to be calm, Adeline said. She could feel the worry coming off you. Boyd's jaw tightened. I was fine. I know, but she couldn't tell. He thought about that for a long time. She could see him thinking about it. Then he nodded once and went back to cleaning the cut with more steadiness than before. The third stage was the evening he brought her a book. She was reading by the lamp when he appeared in the doorway of her room, holding it out. It was worn, the spine repaired with twine, the cover soft from handling. This was my mother's, he said. Adeline looked at it. Then she looked at him. It's a good one, he said. She said so. A pause. I thought you might want something to read. Adeline took the book carefully. Thank you, Boyd. He stood there a second, and then he turned and walked away, and she heard him go to his own room and close the door. She held the book for a long time before she opened it. The winter came to Harwick County in late October, cracking down hard and fast the way Montana winters did, with none of the lingering mildness that sometimes came to softer climates. The first serious snow fell on a Saturday, and by Monday the world outside was white and still and very quiet. Nell got sick on Wednesday. It started the same way these things always start. A cough, a warmth in her cheeks that wasn't from the fire. By Thursday afternoon the fever was real and climbing, and by Thursday night Nell was shaking and half delirious, and calling out in her sleep for her mother. Gideon's face when he came to the doorway of Nell's room was the face of a man who knew exactly how fragile the thing he loved most could be. Adeline had seen it before, in men who'd already lost too much. It was a particular kind of terror, not loud, just very still, and very white around the edges. The doctor, she said, 3 hours in this weather. Road might be closed. Then we work with what we have. She took over Nell's room. She brought water and clean cloth and the elderberry syrup she'd made in September, when she hadn't known why she was making it. Only that the elderberries were there, and it seemed like something a person ought to have. She sat beside Nell through the night, keeping her cool, keeping her drinking, talking to her in a low voice when the fever spiked and the little girl's eyes went wide and frightened. Boyd appeared in the doorway around midnight, his hair sticking up, his face young in a way it usually wasn't. Is she going to be all right? Adeline didn't lie to him. I think so. But I'm not leaving her, okay? He stood there a moment. Do you need anything? Fresh water when you wake up. Try to sleep. He didn't sleep. She heard him moving in the hall, quiet and restless, through the long hours of the night. And once, deep in it, she heard him say something through the wall, in a voice too low to make out. And she thought he was probably talking to his mother the way people did when they were scared enough. Gideon sat in the kitchen all night. She knew because she could hear the creak of the chair and the occasional sound of him adding wood to the stove. He didn't come back to Nell's doorway. Adeline suspected he couldn't bear to. The fever broke on Saturday morning. Nell opened her eyes and looked at Adeline and said hoarsely, Am I dead? No, Adeline said. Good. She closed her eyes again. I'm hungry. Adeline pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed for a moment. Then she stood and went to find Gideon. He was at the kitchen table, still in yesterday's clothes, his head in his hands. He looked up when she came in. She's asking for food, Adeline said. His shoulders came down so fast and so far that it was almost hard to watch. He put his face in his hands again, and this time the reason was different. Adeline went back to Nell. She didn't see Gideon until supper, when he came to the table and sat down and ate without speaking. When the children had gone to bed, he remained at the table, which was unusual, and after a while he said, without looking up from his coffee, I didn't know what to do. I know when their mother was sick. He stopped, started over. I did everything I could think of, and it still wasn't enough. And when Nell started, I couldn't think. I just stood there. You weren't standing there, Adeline said quietly. You were right outside all night, I heard you. He looked at her. You were there, she said. That's not nothing. Something passed across his face, there and gone too fast to name. Thank you, he said. For what you did. She was sick. I have 2 hands and some elderberry syrup. It wasn't complicated. It was. His voice was low, and he meant it. It was complicated, and you didn't hesitate. She met his eyes and held them for a moment. I'm not leaving, she said. He looked at her like the words were something he didn't know what to do with. Then he nodded, slowly, and went to bed. December came with deep cold and clear skies, and an ache in the light that was almost beautiful. Christmas in the Pratt house had apparently not been celebrated properly in 3 years. She could tell by the way the children moved around the idea of it, cautious, not quite willing to want something that had been too painful before. Adeline decorated anyway, not dramatically, a few pine branches on the mantel, some dried berries threaded on a string, a candle in the kitchen window. She made a proper dinner, roasted chicken, creamed potatoes, the last of the apple preserves from the cellar. Boyd set the table without being asked. He did it carefully, with more attention than usual, and she didn't say anything about it because it would have embarrassed him. Nell wore her good dress, and sat very straight the whole meal, like she was attending something formal, and wanted to conduct herself correctly. Gideon came in from the barn early. He stood in the doorway for a moment when he saw the table, the candles, the food, and something moved through his expression quickly. Grief and gratitude tangled so close together they were almost the same thing. He sat down without a word, but he ate more than he usually did, and once across the table his eyes met Adeline's and held. After the meal, when Nell had fallen asleep in her chair and Boyd had drifted off to read, Gideon stayed at the table. Adeline was at the basin washing up, her back to him. She heard him not leave, and then she heard him say quietly, "She used to make pies." Adeline was still. "Margaret, my wife," he paused. "She'd make 3 different kinds for Christmas. The house would smell like sugar for 2 days. The kids would follow her around the kitchen all morning trying to steal pieces." Adeline didn't turn around yet. She kept her hands in the washwater. "I thought if we just skipped it," he said, "it would be easier." "Was it?" Silence? "No." Another pause. "Nothing about it has been easier." She turned around then and dried her hands on her apron and looked at him. He looked back. He looked like a man who was tired of carrying something alone and didn't know how to set it down. "You loved her," Adeline said. "Not a question." "Yes. Flat, simple, true. That doesn't go away." "No, I'm not asking it to." She held his eyes. "You don't have to put her away somewhere to make room. That's not how it works." He studied her face for a long time. She let him. Finally he said, "What do you know about it?" "It wasn't cruel. It was genuine. I lost my father in April," she said. "And before that I lost my mother at 16. And before that I lost—" She stopped. Picked a different sentence. "I know what it costs to pretend something doesn't live in you anymore. And I know what happens to people who pay that cost for long enough." Gideon was quiet. "It doesn't have to cost that," she said. "You can carry her and still—" She paused. "You can carry her and still let the rest of your life keep going." He looked at his coffee cup, then at her, then back at the cup. "Good night, Adeline," he said. "Good night." He went to his room and she stood in the kitchen with the candle burning low in the window and felt the house breathe around her. January came and froze the world solid. The creek stopped running, and the roads to town were cut off for 2 weeks at a stretch. They were 4 people in a house with nowhere to go, and the closeness of it could have gone badly. It didn't. Instead, things softened in ways she hadn't expected. Boyd started sitting with her in the evenings, without a reason, sometimes reading, sometimes just sharpening a knife or oiling a bridle while she sewed, comfortable in the quiet the way he hadn't been before. Nell started requesting specific bedtime stories, which became a ritual. Adeline would sit on the edge of the bed and tell a story, and Nell would correct her if she told one she'd already heard, and the corrections were half the point. And Gideon began to talk. Not much, not in speeches, but small things came loose. Here and there, something that had happened in the south pasture that day, a memory of his own father he'd hauled up from somewhere, his opinion on the weather, which he held strongly and argued for, as if the weather were a neighbor who needed correcting. One evening in late January, she asked him something she'd been holding for a while. "Why Montana?" He looked up from the harness he was repairing. "What?" "You're not from here originally, I can tell. The way you talk about the country, like you're still not finished being surprised by it." He considered this. "Kansas," he said. "Originally." A pause. Margaret wanted to come west. She'd grown up on stories about Montana and she wanted to see if they were true. "Were they?" His mouth did the almost smile thing. "Mostly. And you stayed after." This is where she's buried, he said it simply. Didn't seem right to leave. Adeline nodded. Do you miss Kansas? He asked, which surprised her. It was the first time he'd asked her something personal. No, she said honestly. I miss who I was there a little. I miss my father. But the place itself, she looked at the window at the snow outside in the dark. This country suits me better. I didn't expect that. He looked at her for a moment longer than usual. Then he went back to the harness. February. She found him at the grave on a Sunday afternoon, standing in front of a wooden marker at the edge of the tree line east of the house. She hadn't known it was there. She'd come out to look at a fence line and came around the trees, and there he was, hat in hand, standing still the way he stood still when he was thinking hard about something. She stopped, and he heard her stop. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't know. It's all right. He didn't look back at her. You can come if you want. She came and stood beside him, a few feet to his left, and looked at the marker. It said Margaret Ann Pratt. Below the dates someone had carved. She brought the light with her. The wind moved through the pines overhead, a sound like breathing. Boyd carved it, Gideon said. After. He was 9. Wouldn't let me help. Adeline was quiet. I come out here when I can't get my head straight, he said. Doesn't fix anything, but it helps to say things out loud to her. She was better at listening than I was. I figure she probably still is. Adeline almost smiled. That sounds about right. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. Then he said, I told her about you. Adeline didn't move. I told her you came, and the kids were still standing, and the house was running, and he stopped. I told her I didn't know what to make of you, that you were harder to ignore than I'd planned. He finally looked at her. I planned to just keep my head down, get through it, bring someone in to manage the house and the children and keep that separate from. He made a gesture that meant himself, or his life, or both. But you didn't stay separate. I didn't mean to complicate things, Adeline said, because it was true. I know, that's not. He turned back to the grave marker. That's not what I'm saying. The wind came through again. I'm not good at this, he said. Saying things. I know, I've been afraid that. He stopped, started differently. After Margaret, I thought I'd used it all up. Whatever it was in me that could feel things that way. I thought that was finished. Adeline waited. It's not finished, he said. Very quiet, very still. She looked at him, the side of his face in the pale winter light, and felt something tighten in her chest. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He turned to look at her then, all the way, and what she saw in his face was not quite hope, because he was too careful a man to let it all the way in yet, but it was close. I know that probably doesn't seem like much to offer, she said, but it's what I have. It's more than you think, he said quietly. They walked back to the house side by side, and neither of them said much more, and neither of them needed to. March arrived like an argument that turned slowly into a conversation. Cold one day, mild the next, the ground shifting between hard and soft. The creek opened up again, mud everywhere, boots at the door, Boyd tracking it in twice a day with total indifference. And one morning in the middle of March, Adeline woke up knowing something was wrong. She came out of her room and found Nell at the table, very pale, staring at her hands, and Gideon standing in the kitchen doorway with a piece of paper. What is it? Adeline said. Gideon looked up. Letter from Clement Ferris, her uncle, the man who'd sent her here. What does he want? He says, Gideon's jaw tightened. He says he's found a better arrangement for you. A man in Colorado who's willing to pay more than I did. He wants you back so he can. He stopped, and something went across his face that Adeline had never seen there before. He says the arrangement between us was never formalized as a marriage, just a work contract, and that he retains the right to... He doesn't, Adeline said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He has the original contract, Gideon said. And I have nothing to hold you here, he said. His voice was carefully flat, but it wasn't quite flat enough. Nothing official? Nothing that? Is that what you think? Adeline said. That there's nothing? He looked at her. Boyd had appeared in the hallway, very still, listening. Nell hadn't moved from the table. I've been here 8 months, Adeline said. I have rebuilt your kitchen garden. I have kept your children alive through a fever and a blizzard, and 2 months of being trapped indoors with each other. I have helped you save your south pasture and your sanity, and she stopped. I am not a horse he can sell twice. Something shifted in Gideon's face. Boyd, she said, turning. I am not leaving. Do you understand that? Boyd looked at her. His jaw was working. He nodded once. Tight. Nell. Adeline went and knelt in front of the girl. I am not going to Colorado. Nell's lip was trembling. Promise? I'm not someone who breaks promises, Adeline said. Ask your brother. Nell looked at Boyd. He nodded again. Adeline stood and turned back to Gideon. He was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to look at directly, like something that had been closed for a very long time was coming open and the light was too bright. Marry me, he said, not ask said. Low and certain, like he'd thought about it long enough that the asking was already finished. Adeline looked at him. I should have asked before this, he said. I know that. He exhaled. I've been afraid. And I used that to keep from doing what I should have done months ago. What changed? That letter. He nodded at the paper still in his hand. The idea of you leaving. He stopped, and for a moment the careful flatness was completely gone, and what was underneath it was not complicated at all. I don't want to manage without you. I don't want to. Nell calls you by your name like you're already family. Boyd brought you his mother's book, and a pause. I tell Margaret about you every time I visit that grave. That has to mean something. Adeline was quiet. I'm not going to be easy, he said. You know that already. I know, and I'm not going to pretend Margaret never existed. She's buried at the edge of my tree line, and she's in my children's faces, and she's Gideon. Her voice was gentle. I know. I'm not asking you to bury her twice. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, she said. The word was quiet and certain, and landed in the room like something solid. Boyd made a sound behind them. Not words, just a breath that had relief in it. Nell climbed off her chair and wrapped both arms around Adeline's waist without saying anything, and Adeline's hand came down to rest on the girl's hair. Gideon looked at his daughter, his son, and then at Adeline. The expression on his face was the most open she'd ever seen it. All right, he said. Clement Ferris received a letter from Gideon's attorney in Grover Creek 2 weeks later. The letter said, in formal language, that Adeline Marsh had entered into marriage with Gideon Pratt and was no longer subject to any prior arrangements. The letter was brief and unarguable, and Adeline never heard from Clement Ferris again. They married in the Grover Creek church on a Saturday in late March, with the snow still patchy on the ground and the sun coming in sideways through the windows and making the dust in the air look like something intentional. The minister was a steady man who kept the ceremony simple, which was what they'd asked for. Mrs. Paulson from the general store sat in the front pew and wept with what appeared to be genuine satisfaction. Boyd walked Adeline up the aisle. He'd asked to, 2 nights before, in the same careful way he asked for things he actually wanted, as if each request might be refused and he was preparing for it. She'd said yes without hesitation, and he'd nodded and walked away, but she'd seen his shoulders ease. Nell wore her good dress again, and held a bunch of early wildflowers she'd found at the creek bank, and pressed into Adeline's hands outside the church, serious as a diplomat. Gideon stood at the front of the church in his good coat, and looked at Adeline when she came up the aisle, with an expression she would spend the rest of her life being glad she'd been there to see. They said the words. Simple words, the same words people had been saying for centuries, and Adeline meant each one the way you only meant words after you understood their weight. When the minister said they could go, Boyd shook Gideon's hand and Nell flung herself at Adeline, and outside the sun was warm for the first time all year, and the mountains were very clear against the sky. That was March. By June, the kitchen garden was thick and green, and the ranch had more livestock than it had started the year with. And Gideon came in from the fields in the evenings and sat at the supper table like a man who had somewhere to come home to. Boyd had started going into town once a week to help the livery owner with his horses, learning the work with the focused intensity he brought to everything. Nell had decided to teach herself to draw and covered every spare piece of paper in the house with horses and mountains and lopsided portraits of people she loved. One evening in July, sitting on the porch steps while the light went long and gold over the grass, Gideon said quietly, "Are you happy here?" Adeline thought about the question. She thought about Kansas and her father's voice, and the trunk she'd packed on a Tuesday in June because there was nowhere else to go. She thought about a narrow room at the back of someone else's house and a little girl who wanted to know if she could make biscuits. Yes, she said. And it was true in the way the best things are true. Not perfectly, not without cost, but solidly, down to the bone. He reached over and covered her hand with his. They sat there while the sun went down and the first stars appeared, and inside the house she could hear Boyd and Nell arguing about something small and unimportant, the kind of argument that only happened between people who were comfortable enough to argue, and the sound of it was so ordinary and so good that she held on to it quietly, the way you hold on to something you know you might have almost missed. She had been handed over for a train ticket and a piece of paper. She had ended up here. Sometimes the worst arrangements turned out to be the truest ones. You just had to be willing to stay long enough to find out.